I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. The air that day at the Moores Lake House on Lake Tahoe smelled of pine needles and fear. To everyone else, it probably just smelled like pine and the smoke from the grill that had long since cooled, but I always caught that second bitter undertone. I sat on a wicker chair on the porch, a little separate from the big table, and watched my daughter Natalie. She moved around, pouring aged scotch for her husband Benjamin and his father Richard, laughing at their clumsy jokes. Her laughter sounded too bright, too strained, like that of a child terrified of punishment, trying desperately to prove she was good. My heart tightened at that laughter. Even after 5 years of marriage, she was still trying to win their affection, the affection of people incapable of loving anyone but themselves. Their country estate matched their status. A huge, soulless house of dark wood with massive picture windows that stared out at Lake Tahoe like cold, vacant eyes. The lawn was flawless. Not a single dandelion was allowed to grow. Everything was too perfect, too calculated, devoid of any warmth. Even the sun seemed different here. Its rays didn't warm. They just highlighted the glassy sheen of the water and the cold gleam of the expensive cars by the gate. I only came here for Natalie. Every time she would talk me into it. "Mom, please come. They want to see the whole family. It's important to them." I knew in my heart it was important to her. She wanted to believe she had a real family. But looking at Richard's self-satisfied face and Benjamin's perpetually mocking eyes, all I saw was a beautiful facade hiding rot. I remembered the first time Natalie brought Benjamin home. She was glowing with excitement. "He's different, Mom," she'd said. "He saw my paintings at the gallery opening and said they spoke to his soul." Her eyes shone with hope, and I wanted to believe it too. Benjamin Moore had seemed charming then, handsome in that polished corporate way, with just enough knowledge of art to impress my daughter. I didn't see the calculation behind his smile, the way he studied her reactions, calibrating his responses to draw her in closer. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, her vibrant, colorful paintings had become more subdued, her bold strokes more controlled. "The gallery prefers more marketable work," she'd explained, not meeting my eyes. I should have pushed harder then. I should have asked more questions. Now I watched as she became smaller in their presence, diminishing herself to fit into the narrow space they allowed her. Richard and Benjamin had been drinking heavily. Their forced merriment gave way to uninhibited aggression. They talked loudly, gesticulated wildly, and every movement they made radiated a feeling of absolute impunity. They were the masters of this place, the masters of their lives, and Natalie was just another beautiful object in their collection. "Why is our little city girl Natalie all bundled up?" Richard thundered, fixing Natalie with a heavy stare. She was wearing a thick autumn jacket and jeans. The day was cool, and a sharp wind blew off the lake. "Afraid of catching a cold, Softy?" Natalie smiled nervously. "It's just windy, Richard," she said, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "Windy?" Benjamin scoffed, mimicking his father. "Back in my day, girls were swimming in October, and it did them good. They were tough. This is a greenhouse generation." I felt a cold dread settling inside me. I didn't like this conversation. It was like sharpening a knife, slow, methodical, full of anticipation. "Leave her alone," I said loud enough for them to hear. My voice sounded foreign on that porch, like the squeak of an old floorboard in a new house. Benjamin turned to me, a malicious spark flashing in his eyes. He hated it when I interfered. He thought I was just a crazy old woman fussing over her daughter. "Helen Anderson, don't worry. We're just having some fun, right, honey?" He winked at my daughter. Natalie nodded, forcing another smile. "Of course, Mom, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. I saw Richard and Benjamin exchange a look. It was their special look. Predatory, conspiratorial. It was how wolves look at a sheep before they attack. "Well, let's test how tough you are," Richard suddenly declared, rising from the table. His massive frame cast a long shadow. "Benjamin, help me. We'll escort Natalie down to the water for a little dip." "What are you doing?" I stood up too, my heart beat fast like a trapped bird. "Richard, stop it. This isn't funny." But they didn't hear me anymore. They grabbed Natalie by the arms. She gasped in surprise, more from shock than fear. She still thought it was a game. "Benjamin, no! Dad, let me go!" she stammered, trying to pull away. But her laugh only morphed into a nervous giggle. She didn't want to spoil the mood or appear weak. They dragged her across the lawn toward the wooden pier. I hurried after them, my knees protesting with each step. "Stop right now! You're drunk! You don't know what you're doing!" I shouted. They ignored me. I was air to them, an annoying buzz. They hauled her to the very end of the pier, which jutted out over the dark, icy water. The lake looked black and bottomless. "Go on, city girl. Show us what you've got," Benjamin snarled. "No, please don't," Natalie screamed. At that moment, she finally understood. She understood it wasn't a joke. Her voice held genuine horror. I ran towards them, trying to pull Benjamin away, but he shoved me roughly aside. I stumbled, nearly falling, and in that instant, with one last smug laugh, they pushed her. It all happened in a blink. My daughter's body, heavy with soaked clothing, vanished beneath the surface with a dull splash. Only dark ripples and a few air bubbles remained. Silence. 1 second, 2, 3. A silence that roared louder in my ears than any scream. Then they burst into loud, booming laughter, as if they had just witnessed a brilliant comedy. "That'll wake her up," Richard said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. But Natalie didn't resurface. I stood frozen, staring at the black water. My own scream was trapped in my throat. Finally, she came up just for a moment. I saw her pale, distorted face. A thin trail of blood ran down her temple, dark, almost black on her wet skin. Her eyes were empty, unfocused. She didn't scream, didn't thrash. She just stared into nothing. Then her body went limp again and began to sink slowly. That was when I finally screamed. It was an inhuman animal cry that tore from the depths of my soul. "Help! She's drowning! She hit her head!" My voice echoed across the water, desperate and alone. Richard and Benjamin stood on the shore, unmoving. "Oh, come on, Helen," Benjamin waved casually. "Stop the drama. She can swim." "End this hysteria," Richard added, turning toward his black SUV. "She'll climb out on her own. A little cool down won't hurt." They turned and walked to their SUV, their expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. I looked at them, unable to believe my eyes. They were simply leaving her there in the icy water. I screamed again, my voice cracking. "Where are you going? Come back! She's dying!" The car door slammed shut. The engine roared to life. Benjamin stuck his head out the window and, still grinning, yelled, "Don't ruin our evening, mother-in-law. See you at home." And they sped away. The crunch of gravel under the tires, the distant hum of the engine, and then silence. Only the lapping of the water and my desperate, helpless scream dying in the cold evening air above the black, indifferent lake. I stared at the water, and the scream froze in my throat. It turned into an icy knot that pressed down on my lungs, making it hard to breathe. The world narrowed to that dark spot on the lake surface and the spreading ripples. The panic that had just been tearing me apart suddenly condensed, solidifying into something else, hard and heavy. It sank to the bottom of my soul, replaced by a shrill, unnatural emptiness. In that emptiness, I heard a distant sound, the putt-putt of a boat motor. I turned my head. Behind the reeds, about 100 yards from the shore, a small inflatable boat was moving slowly. A man in a faded camouflage jacket sat inside. A fisherman. I didn't scream again. I had no voice. I simply raised my hand and pointed to the spot where my daughter had disappeared underwater. The man in the boat didn't understand at first, but then he must have recognized my face. Something about my stillness, my frozen gesture, told him more than any scream could have. He turned the boat sharply, the motor howled, and the boat shot toward the pier, leaving a foamy trail behind it. He was there a minute later. "What happened?" he shouted. His face was weathered and serious. I couldn't answer. I just pointed at the water again. "There," I finally managed to nod. He asked no more questions. He cut the engine, grabbed a boat hook, and began peering into the dark depths. I stood there watching him work. Every movement was precise, deliberate. He knew this lake. He knew what to do. And I, who had lived so many years, who had endured so much, was in that moment as helpless as a newborn kitten. He hooked her jacket with the boat hook. I saw a flash of light fabric underwater. He leaned over the edge, risking falling in himself, and pulled her up with incredible effort. As he hauled her into the boat, I saw her face, blue, lifeless. In that moment, the ice inside me broke, but it didn't melt. It shattered into 1,000 sharp shards. I pulled out my cell phone. My fingers wouldn't obey, but I forced them to dial 911. 911, ambulance. I spoke calmly and clearly to the operator, giving the address of the vacation community and directions to the lake. I wasn't crying. My voice sounded strange, mechanical. While the fisherman performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in his boat, and I gave instructions to the paramedics from the shore, images flashed through my mind. Natalie, at 5 years old, crying with a scraped knee in my arms. Her as a first grader with giant white ribbons proudly carrying her first bouquet. Her at high school graduation twirling in her simple but beautiful dress, her eyes shining with joy. And her on her wedding day looking at Benjamin with such hope, such faith that I desperately wanted to shout, "Don't do it, baby! They will destroy you." But I stayed silent. I stayed silent then, and I stayed silent all these years for her fragile, hard-won happiness. I smiled at these people, shook their hands, sat at their table, and swallowed their poisonous jokes like bitter medicine. I thought that was my sacrifice. A sacrifice for her family. What a fool I was. The ambulance arrived quickly. Medics ran out with a stretcher. They surrounded Natalie, connecting her to monitors and covering her with a rescue blanket. I heard snippets of sentences. Pulse weak, severe hypothermia, head trauma. They worked together, coordinated and fast like a single mechanism. The fisherman stood nearby, kneading his cap in his hands. "Thank you," I managed to say. "You saved her life." He nodded, his eyes kind but troubled. "Name's Jack Cooper. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan. Never thought I'd be fishing someone out of Lake Tahoe." He handed me a worn business card. "If you need anything, a statement, anything at all, you call me, ma'am." I took the card, my fingers still numb. "Helen Anderson," I said, "and that's my daughter, Natalie." "What happened?" he asked carefully. "Her husband and father-in-law thought it would be funny to push her in," I said, my voice flat. "They left when she started drowning." Something dark flashed across his face. He understood. Men like Jack Cooper always understand the difference between a prank and cruelty. "You got someone you can call?" he asked. "You shouldn't be alone right now." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did. My husband had died 3 years ago. Natalie was my only child. Friends? They had drifted away after I sold our home to help Natalie and Benjamin with their down payment. But then I remembered. There was someone. "I'll be fine," I told Jack. "Thank you again." He seemed reluctant to leave, but eventually turned and walked back to his boat. I watched the flurry of medics, the flashing lights of the ambulance reflecting in the still water of the lake. And in that moment, I knew the old life was over. The life where I was just a mother-in-law, just a quiet retired librarian whom no one took seriously. That woman died right there on the pier the moment her daughter went under, laughed at by her own husband. I pulled out my phone again. My fingers no longer trembled with shock. Now they trembled with something else. A cold, pure rage like distilled water, fueled by a decision already made. I scrolled through my address book. Names, 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 and there he was. A single name. Juan. I hadn't called that number in over 10 years, not since he destroyed the career of a very influential man and was practically blacklisted from his profession. We had fought hard back then. I didn't accept his methods, his obsession, his ruthlessness. And now that was exactly what I needed. I pressed call. It rang for a long time. I was sure he wouldn't answer or had changed his number, but on the fourth ring, his deep, smoky voice came on. "Yeah, who is it?" He didn't recognize my number. "Juan, it's me." My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I didn't want the medics to hear me. This wasn't their conversation. Silence fell on the other end. A long, heavy silence. I could almost physically feel him straighten up, the gears in his brain beginning to turn. He didn't ask what happened. He never wasted time on unnecessary questions. "I'm listening, Helen," he finally said. I looked at the road where the Moores had driven away 10 minutes earlier. They were probably already nearing the city, likely with music playing, laughing, and looking forward to a cozy evening at home. They didn't know yet that their cozy world was already cracking. "They're heading home now," I whispered into the phone. "Do what you do best." I didn't wait for a reply. I just hung up. The decision was made. All bridges were burned. The old rules no longer existed. The medics slammed the ambulance doors shut. The siren wailed and the vehicle sped away, carrying my daughter with it. I remained standing on the shore of that black lake in the deepening twilight. And for the first time in many years, I felt no fear, but a strange, terrifying calm. The calm of a person who has just pulled the trigger. I called a cab. It came quickly. An old car that smelled of gasoline and cheap air freshener. The driver, an older, mustachioed man, looked at me anxiously in the rearview mirror. I must have looked terrible, my clothes stained with dirt, my face frozen into a gray mask. He tried to start a conversation, asking if everything was okay, but I stayed silent. All the words had been left behind on the shore. The entire drive to the city hospital, I stared out the window at the passing lights, but I didn't see them. In my head, with cold, detached clarity, a different scene was playing out. A vision of what was happening at the Moores' house right at that moment. I could see their black SUV driving through the automated gate of their massive fortress-like home. Richard stepped out first, heavy, authoritarian. Benjamin followed behind, still smirking, full of drunken arrogance. They entered their sterile, lifeless foyer, which smelled of expensive cologne and furniture polish. Their footsteps echoed in the silence. They weren't worried. Why should they worry? Natalie was strong, healthy, could swim. She had just been dunked. She was scared. No big deal. And the mother-in-law was always hysterical. She would scream and moan, and then Natalie would come as always and fix everything. She would say, "Mom, stop. They didn't mean anything by it. They're just kidding." She had always defended them. Always. I imagined Benjamin pouring himself another scotch, tossing ice into the glass. The ice clinked against the glass, just as the last coin in a beggar's pocket might clink. Richard turned on the massive plasma screen TV, some financial news program, numbers, charts, serious faces. They immersed themselves in their world, where everything was measured by money and power. What had happened an hour ago by the lake was just a minor annoyance, a bothersome interlude that was already almost forgotten. They were, after all, above consequences. Then the phone rang. Not a cell phone, but the landline. They kept it for the sake of seriousness. Richard answered sluggishly, and I heard his face change. Not from horror, no, but from annoyance. "Which hospital? ICU? What nonsense?" He listened, frowning, his lips pressed into a contemptuous line. "Yes, I'm the husband's father. Yes, got it?" And he slammed the receiver down. "What the hell?" he said to Benjamin. "Your wife is at the hospital. Looks like your mother-in-law really did call the doctors. She must have played the drowning role a little too well." Benjamin grimaced as if he had a toothache. This was ruining his evening. It was an inconvenience, a problem that needed solving. And he hated solving problems. He loved creating them. The alcohol had already worn off a bit, leaving a dull headache and a sticky feeling of anger. He picked up his cell phone, found the number for my sweetheart, and called. I was sitting in the icy corridor of the emergency room when her phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I took it out. The screen lit up with my sweetheart. What cruel irony. I stared at the words for a few seconds, then swiped the screen and held the phone to my ear. "Hello," Benjamin said in his voice. There was no fear or remorse, only tired irritation. "Sweetheart, where are you? What did your mother pull now?" "They called my dad and scared him." I remained silent. I let him talk. "Sweetheart, are you listening to me? Stop sulking. Come home. Look. We got carried away. It happens." Then I answered. My voice was calm and quiet like the surface of the lake after they had left. "She is alive." Silence fell on the other end. He hadn't expected to hear me. "Helen, where's Natalie? Put her on the phone. Come on, I need to—" "Don't come here," I said just as quietly and hung up. I sat on the hard hospital bench, looking at the dingy walls and inhaling the scent of bleach and unfamiliar suffering. An hour passed, then another. The doctor came out, young with tired eyes. Dr. Emily Grant, her name tag read. Her face was kind but serious. "Mrs. Anderson, your daughter is stable now. She has a concussion, hypothermia, and water in her lungs, but she'll live." She touched my arm gently. She was very lucky. Much longer in that water, and— She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "Can I see her?" I asked. "Yes, but only for a few minutes. She's heavily sedated." Dr. Grant led me down the sterile corridor to the ICU. The rhythmic beeping of machines greeted me before I even entered the room. Natalie lay there surrounded by cables, pale, tiny, in a huge hospital bed, connected to machines that breathed and lived for her. She had a bandage around her head beneath which a dark red stain was visible. I looked at her and felt nothing but a cold, clean heaviness. The love hadn't disappeared. It had merely receded, giving way to something older and more terrifying. An instinct. The instinct to protect one's young at any cost. When I returned to the corridor, a surprise awaited me. A young nurse called to me. "Mrs. Anderson, you have a delivery." She pointed to a vase containing an arrangement. No, not an arrangement. A huge, monstrous composition of white lilies. Their heavy, sweet smell, the scent of a funeral, filled the entire corridor. A white envelope was tucked between the flowers. I knew who it was from. I walked over and took the envelope. Inside, on expensive embossed paper, one sentence was written in calligraphic script. "My dear, let's not let your mother's theatrics spoil our fun." I read it, then read it again. Not a single muscle moved in my face. I folded the note neatly and put it in my pocket with Natalie's cell phone. This note wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of war. They not only regretted nothing, but they didn't even understand what had happened. They still thought it was a game, a performance staged by me. They still saw themselves as the directors. They didn't know that I had already changed the script, and in my version of this play, entirely different roles were cast for them. I turned to the nurse. "Please throw these away," I said, nodding toward the lilies. "My daughter is allergic to them." The nurse looked at me confused, then at the luxurious flowers, then back at me. Pity and incomprehension mixed in her gaze. She probably thought I was insane with grief. She nodded and walked away, and I was left in the corridor, which without that screaming white spot now seemed even grayer and more faceless. I spent the night at the hospital on a hard chair outside the ICU door. I didn't sleep. I stared at the white door behind which my daughter was fighting for her life, and I planned. But these weren't the thoughts a mother usually has in such a situation. I didn't pray, didn't cry, didn't replay the events in my mind. I plotted. I knew Juan was already working. I knew my brother. My short phone call was not just a plea for help. It was a signal. A signal he had been waiting for all those years of obscurity without knowing it. Juan was like a hound dog that had been chained up for too long. In the past, he had been the best investigative journalist in the country. He saw through people, sniffed out lies like a predator smells blood. He knew how to find threads that others wouldn't even dare to pull. But his methods were too harsh, too reckless for the glossy world of major journalism. He didn't play by the rules. He cut open sores without caring who he splattered with the pus. And one day, he touched the wrong man. His career was destroyed. He was fired, lost his press credentials, became an outcast. He retreated underground, scraping by with small freelance jobs, writing under pseudonyms. But he hadn't lost his edge. I knew that, and I also knew where he would start. He wouldn't dig in the present. That was too trivial for him. Arguments, drunken outbursts, family squabbles. That wasn't his level. Juan always looked for the root, the cause. He would dive into the past of Richard Moore. The morning brought the smell of hospital coffee and good news. Natalie was moved to a regular room. She was conscious again. The doctor said it was a miracle. I knew it wasn't a miracle. It was her will to live. My girl had always been a fighter. She had just been fighting on the wrong side for too long. I walked in. She lay there, her head turned to the window. She was very weak, barely speaking. "Mom," she whispered. I took her hand. It was cold. "I'm here, baby. I'm with you." She looked at me and tears welled up in her eyes. "Did he call? Benjamin?" I didn't lie to her. "Yes. And he sent flowers." "What did he say?" A faint, dying hope was in her voice. I looked her straight in the eye. "He said I was being dramatic." She didn't answer, just turned back to the window, and a tear slowly ran down her cheek. Just one. In that single tear was more pain and disappointment than in any scream. In that moment, I knew she was starting to see, too. The icy lake water had washed away the veil she had worn for years. The phone rang in the afternoon when I had gone out to the hospital park for some fresh air. The number was unknown. "Yes, this is Helen." Juan's voice was hoarse and tired. He hadn't slept all night. I knew it by the way he spoke the words, as if rolling hot stones in his mouth. "I have something for you." He didn't beat around the bush. He got straight to the point. "I found some old archives, 22 years ago. Same lake, a different boat. Richard Moore and his business partner at the time, a man named Henry Walker. They went fishing. Only Moore returned. I listened, and the cold that had settled in me by the lakeshore grew denser. He claimed Walker was drunk, fell overboard, and hit his head on the propeller. An accident, Juan continued. The case was closed after a week. Too fast for a story like that. I tracked down the detective who handled the case, Detective Frank Delaney. He's retired now and keeps bees in a quiet rural town in the Sierra foothills. The old man fought me for a long time, Juan said, but I know how to be persuasive. I knew what he meant. His persuasion could break stone, too. Delaney caved. He said he was heavily pressured from above. They brought him an envelope full of cash and a photo of his daughter, a college student, and he signed everything. He said that sin has tormented him his whole life. The picture that was coming together was gruesome, ugly, but terrifyingly logical. But that's not all, Juan said. Walker had a son. He was about 10 years old back then. They had no contact. The father had left the family. I found him. He works now as a simple auto mechanic in Oakland. He hates his father, but he kept some of his things, among them letters. Letters Walker wrote to his sister shortly before his death. In them, he wrote clearly that Moore had cheated him out of almost all his business shares. He intended to go to the district attorney. A week after that letter, he accidentally drowned. I closed my eyes. The vague, unexplained anxiety I had felt all those years near the moors, the worry that everyone, including my own daughter, attributed to my overly anxious nature, wasn't anxiety. It was intuition, a deep animal sense that had screamed at me that monsters were living next to my daughter. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked. I only felt a strange, icy confirmation, as if I had walked through a dark room all my life, bumping into furniture. And now someone had flipped the light switch, and I saw that the room was full of traps. "What now?" I asked. My voice was perfectly calm. "Now we have leverage," Juan replied. "They think this is a family dispute. They don't know we're playing a different game." He was right. This was no longer a reaction to their act. It was no longer the revenge of an injured mother. It was an act of restoring justice, the justice that had been sunk with Henry Walker's body in that same lake 22 years ago. I was ready to go all the way. Now I not only had the right, I had the evidence. I hung up and sat on the bench in the hospital park for a long time. The autumn sun shone faintly through the bare branches of the trees, but it didn't warm me. I looked at my hands. They were no longer trembling. They were steady. They were the hands of a person who knew what to do next. The next 2 days passed in the fog of hospital routine. I brought Natalie broth that I made on a small electric burner right in the room, helped her walk to the bathroom, and read classics to her in a soft voice. We barely talked about what happened. Words weren't necessary. Something new, fragile, but genuine developed between us. A silent understanding. She no longer tried to justify them. She simply remained silent. And in her silence was more condemnation than in all my words. Benjamin stopped calling after his third attempt went straight to voicemail. He had apparently decided to starve us out. He was waiting for Natalie to calm down and call him herself, as was always the case after their arguments. He didn't understand that this time everything was different. He was still playing his game by his rules in his small, cozy world where he was king. He didn't know that outside his world the clouds were already gathering. Across town, in a small room at the airport budget inn, Juan Anderson sat hunched over his laptop. The blue light of the screen illuminated his weathered face, casting harsh shadows that accentuated every line earned through years of chasing stories no one else dared to touch. A half-empty cup of cold coffee sat beside him. The room smelled of cigarettes, though he'd quit years ago. Old habits died hard when the hunt was on. On the wall above the bed, he'd created what he called his crime board. Photos, printouts, and sticky notes connected with red yarn formed a complex web. At the center was Richard Moore's face, cut from a business magazine, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Juan rubbed his eyes and leaned back. The springs of the cheap chair protested. His back ached, but the pain was familiar, almost comforting. Pain meant he was working, and work kept the demons at bay. His phone rang, a local reporter who still owed him favors. "Got something for you, Anderson," the voice said without preamble. "That financial statement from '03 you asked about? Moore's company took a major hit that quarter, then miraculously recovered within weeks. Stock price doubled. Very convenient timing right after Walker's death." Juan grunted in acknowledgement. "Any mention of insurance payouts?" "Better. A mysterious capital acquisition listed in the footnotes. $8 million. Source undisclosed." "Walker's shares," Juan muttered. "Thanks, Dave. I owe you." "Actually, I still owe you, after what you did for my sister." Dave's voice trails off. "Just be careful, Anderson. People who go after Richard Moore tend to disappear." "Like Henry Walker?" Juan asked darkly. "Exactly like Henry Walker." Juan ended the call and stared at the wall. 22 years ago, Henry Walker had been Richard Moore's equal partner in what was then a struggling investment firm. Walker was the money man, the financial genius. Moore was the face, the charmer, the one who brought in clients. Then Walker drowned in a tragic accident, and within a month, Moore had sole control of the company. Within a year, Moore Financial had become one of the most aggressive investment firms on the West Coast. Juan tapped his pen against his teeth. The pattern was too familiar. Someone becomes inconvenient. Someone disappears. Someone profits. But this time, Moore had made a critical mistake. He'd gone after family. Juan's family. And Juan Anderson never forgave anyone who touched his family. His relationship with Helen had always been complicated. She was the steady one, the sensible one, the one who believed in rules and order and the fundamental goodness of people. He was the cynic, the troublemaker, the one who saw the darkness lurking beneath polished surfaces. They'd grown apart after the Senator Williams scandal. Juan had exposed Williams' corruption ring, but in the process, he'd used methods that crossed ethical lines. Helen couldn't understand why he'd done it. She'd called him reckless, dangerous, said he'd become what he was fighting against. Maybe she was right. But sometimes you had to wade through the muck to catch the predators hiding in it. And Richard Moore was definitely a predator. Juan reached for a thick folder marked Walker H.E. Correspondence and flipped it open. Inside were photocopies of letters, their edges slightly blurry but the handwriting clear enough. Henry Walker's final communications to his sister, Marjorie. One passage in particular caught his eye. "Rich knows I found the discrepancies in the Eastlake accounts. I've asked him to explain, but he just laughs it off. Says it's normal creative accounting. But $2.3 million doesn't just disappear into thin air. If he doesn't provide answers by Friday, I'm going to the DA. I don't care if it tanks the company. Some things matter more than money." The letter was dated October 12th, 2003. 3 days later, Henry Walker drowned in Lake Tahoe. Juan closed the folder and rubbed his temples. He needed more. A letter wasn't enough. He needed the detective who'd signed off on the accidental death. He needed physical evidence. He needed someone who could testify that Moore was capable of cold-blooded murder. And now, after what happened to Natalie, he had that last piece. Now he had witnesses. The fisherman who'd pulled her out. The EMTs who'd treated her. The doctor who'd seen her injuries. Now he had a pattern. Juan's phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number. Delaney's address confirmed. 1487 Pine Ridge Road, Placerville. Lives alone. Keeps to himself. No security system. Juan didn't bother responding. The fewer digital traces, the better. He shut down his laptop, slid it into his battered messenger bag, and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. It was time to pay a visit to the detective who'd helped bury the truth 22 years ago. Detective Frank Delaney's retirement home was a modest single-story house on the edge of a small town in the Sierra foothills. White paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the front yard was dominated by a dozen beehives arranged in neat rows. Juan parked his rental car a quarter-mile down the road and approached on foot, keeping to the tree line. Old habits. When you're hunting, you don't announce your arrival. As he reached the edge of the property, he spotted an elderly man in a protective beekeeping suit tending to one of the hives. Even beneath the mesh mask, Juan could make out a face carved by years of seeing the worst humanity had to offer. A cop's face. Hard eyes that had long ago stopped being surprised by cruelty. Juan waited patiently until Delaney finished and began walking back to the house, removing his protective gear as he went. Then he stepped into view. "Detective Delaney?" The old man froze, one gloved hand halfway to his face. His eyes narrowed, assessing the threat. "Haven't been called detective in 15 years, he said carefully. "Who's asking?" "Juan Anderson. I'd like to talk to you about Henry Walker." Delaney's face hardened. "Don't know the name, and I don't give interviews." "I'm not here for an interview," Juan said, stepping closer. "I'm here about my niece, Natalie Anderson. She nearly drowned in Lake Tahoe 3 days ago. Pushed in by her husband, Benjamin Moore, and his father, Richard Moore. Ring any bells now?" Delaney's weathered face paled slightly. "You should leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Juan said quietly. "Henry Walker, Lake Tahoe, October 15th, 2003. You signed the report calling it an accident despite clear evidence of foul play. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Frank, but we are going to talk." Delaney stared at him for a long moment, then his shoulders slumped. "Come inside," he said, his voice suddenly tired. "But I'm not promising anything." The inside of Delaney's house was as sparse as the outside. Minimal furniture, no photos, no personal touches except for a collection of books on beekeeping and a half-finished model ship on the dining table. The retired detective poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tumbler and pushed it across the table to Juan before pouring one for himself. "You recorded my voice the moment you stepped onto my property, didn't you?" Delaney asked. Juan didn't confirm or deny it. He just waited. Delaney sighed and took a long sip of his drink. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Juan said simply. "Start with why you buried a murder." Delaney's hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. "You don't understand the position I was in. I had a daughter in college, Stanford, medical school, her whole future ahead of her. And Moore threatened her," Juan finished. Delaney nodded. "Not directly. He was too smart for that. But his people showed up at my house with an envelope. Inside was $50,000 in cash and a photo of my Lily leaving her dorm. The message was clear." "So you falsified evidence." "I omitted evidence," Delaney corrected, a flash of his old defiance returning. "The bruising on Walker's neck that wasn't consistent with an accident. The fact that he was a strong swimmer who wouldn't have drowned even if he fell in. The witness who heard shouting from the boat before Walker went overboard." "You protected a killer," Juan said, his voice hard. "I protected my daughter," Delaney snapped, then quieter. "And I've paid for it every day since. Lily never knew why I suddenly could afford her tuition. She thought I'd taken out loans. She's a pediatric surgeon now, saving lives every day. But sometimes I wonder if those lives balance against the one I helped cover up." Juan leaned forward, his eyes locked on Delaney's. "There's a chance to make it right. My niece survived, but next time someone else might not be so lucky. Moore is still out there, still thinking he's untouchable. "What do you want from me?" Delaney asked, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "I want your testimony. I want you to put on record everything you know about the Walker case." Delaney laughed bitterly. "And face perjury charges? Lose my pension? Go to jail in my 70s? "I can protect you," Juan said. "Whistleblower status, immunity deal. But I need something concrete first, something I can take to the right people." Delaney was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to a painting on the wall, a mediocre landscape that had probably come with the frame. He removed it, revealing a small wall safe. "I kept insurance," he said as he spun the dial. "Didn't trust Moore not to come back someday and finish the job." The safe clicked open, and Delaney withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. He handed it to Juan. "The original autopsy photos, the ones that never made it into the official report. The coroner owed me a favor and gave me copies. There's also my notes from the witness interview that I conveniently lost." Juan took the envelope carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. "This is a start," he said. "But I need one more thing. I need Walker's son, Ethan." Delaney shook his head. "That kid hated his father. Walker walked out when the boy was 6. Hardly saw him after that." "But he kept his father's letters," Juan pressed. "Letters that prove Walker was about to expose Moore for financial fraud right before he died." Something flickered in Delaney's eyes, a spark of the detective he'd once been. "You've done your homework." "Always do," Juan said. "Now do you know where I can find Ethan Walker?" Delaney hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Last I heard, he was working as a mechanic in Oakland, Bennett's auto shop on East Shore Highway. But that was a few years ago." Juan stood up, tucking the envelope carefully into his jacket. "Thank you for this. When the time comes, I hope you'll do the right thing." Delaney didn't answer directly. He just stared into his whiskey. "You know Moore won't go down easily. He has connections, money, power. He'll fight dirty." "So will I," Juan said simply. As he reached the door, Delaney called after him. "Why are you really doing this, Anderson? Revenge for your niece?" Juan paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Justice," he said quietly. "For Henry Walker, for my niece, and for you, Frank, so you can finally sleep at night." The drive to Oakland took just under 2 hours. Bennett's auto shop was exactly where Delaney had said it would be. A weathered building with 3 garage bays and a small office area. The sign out front had seen better days, the paint faded by years of sun and exhaust fumes. Juan parked across the street and watched for a while. 2 mechanics worked on vehicles in the open bays. One was older, heavy-set, probably the owner. The other was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the lean build of someone who worked with his hands for a living. After 20 minutes of observation, Juan crossed the street and approached the younger man, who was bent over the engine of a Toyota sedan. "Ethan Walker?" Juan asked. The man straightened, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He had his father's eyes. Juan had studied enough photos of Henry Walker to recognize the resemblance. "Who's asking?" Ethan said, wariness instantly apparent in his stance. "My name's Juan Anderson. I'd like to talk to you about your father." Ethan's face hardened. "Nothing to talk about. Haven't seen him in 20 years. Don't care to." "He's been dead for 22 years, Juan said quietly. "Murdered by Richard Moore at Lake Tahoe." Something flashed in Ethan's eyes, not grief, but a sharp, sudden interest. Then it was gone, replaced by studied indifference. "The official report says it was an accident," Ethan said, turning back to the engine. "And even if it wasn't, why would I care? He walked out on me and my mom when I was 6. Birthday cards and Christmas presents don't make you a father." "But you kept his letters," Juan pressed. "The ones he wrote to your Aunt Marjorie before he died." Ethan's hands stilled over the engine. Without looking up, he said, "Boss, I'm taking 15. The older man in the next bay grunted acknowledgement. Ethan wiped his hands again and jerked his head toward the back of the shop. "This way." He led Juan to a small break room with a scarred table and a humming refrigerator. Closing the door, he turned to face Juan. "How do you know about those letters?" he demanded. "I'm investigating Richard Moore," Juan said. "Your father was about to expose him for financial fraud right before he died. Those letters could be the key to finally bringing Moore to justice." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Justice? After 22 years? The statute of limitations?" "There's no statute of limitations on murder," Juan cut in. "And Moore just tried to kill my niece. Same lake, same M.O. She survived, but the next person might not be so lucky." Ethan studied Juan's face, searching for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or ulterior motives. Finally, he sighed and sat down at the table. "I hated my father for a long time," he said quietly. "Blamed him for leaving, for not fighting harder to stay in my life. It wasn't until after he died that I found out the truth. That he'd been sending my mom child support all along. That he'd set up a college fund for me. That he'd tried to see me dozens of times, but my mom had refused." Ethan's hands clenched on the table. "By then it was too late. He was gone, and all I had left were those letters my aunt gave me after the funeral. Letters where he talked about missing me, about hoping to reconnect someday when I was older, about wanting to make things right." Juan sat down across from him. "In those letters, did he mention Richard Moore? The company? Any financial irregularities?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He said Moore was cooking the books, that millions were missing from client accounts, that he was going to the DA if Moore didn't come clean. And 3 days later he was dead," Juan finished. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I always suspected it wasn't an accident, but no one would listen to a 16-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder." "I'm listening now," Juan said, "and I need those letters, Ethan, not just for my niece, for your father, to finally get him the justice he deserves." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he focused on Juan again. "The letters are at my apartment. I can get them for you tonight. But I want to be part of this. I want to see Moore go down." Juan considered this. Having Ethan involved complicated things made the operation more vulnerable, but the conviction in the younger man's eyes was unmistakable. Sometimes justice needed witnesses. "Okay," Juan agreed, "but you follow my lead. This gets dangerous. You step back. Deal?" Ethan nodded firmly. "Deal." As Juan left the auto shop, he felt the pieces falling into place. The retired detective with a guilty conscience. The son seeking justice for the father he never knew. The evidence hidden for decades. And at the center of it all, Richard Moore, a man who thought his money and power made him invulnerable. A man who would soon discover how wrong he was. Back at the hospital, Natalie's recovery continued to surprise her doctors. By the 4th day, she was sitting up unassisted, the color returning to her cheeks, though the dark circles under her eyes spoke of restless nights. I arranged a private room for her, paying the difference out of my savings. It was worth every penny to keep her away from the constant interruptions and noise of the shared ward. Here, in the quiet, we could talk, really talk, for the first time in years. That afternoon, as I helped her wash her hair, carefully avoiding the bandage on her temple, she finally spoke about what had happened. "I always knew they were cruel," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the small window. "But I thought they weren't cruel to me. That I was different, special." "You are special," I said, gently rinsing the suds from her hair with a plastic cup. "Just not to them." She winced, but not from physical pain. I gave up so much for him. My friends, my art, my voice. I remembered the first year of her marriage, how her paintings had changed. Gone were the bold, vibrant strokes that had defined her work in art school. Gone were the unconventional subjects, the raw, emotional power. Instead, she'd produced safe, marketable landscapes and still lifes. Things that matched living room sofas and didn't challenge the viewer. The gallery owner said my original style was too niche, she continued, as if reading my thoughts. But it was Benjamin who arranged that meeting. Benjamin who suggested the new direction. "Honey, you're too talented to be stuck in the experimental scene," he said. "Let me help you become commercially viable." She laughed bitterly. And I believed him. I thought he was looking out for me. "He was charming," I said, wringing out her hair with a towel. "Charming people are dangerous because we want to believe them." Natalie turned to look at me, her eyes suddenly intense. "Why didn't you warn me? You must have seen it." The question stung, but I owed her honesty. "I tried, in my way. But you were so in love, so certain. And I was afraid of losing you, of pushing you further into his arms by opposing the relationship." She nodded slowly. "I wouldn't have listened anyway. I was too blinded by his attention, his world. Do you know he proposed to me at the MoMA opening, right in front of my favorite painting? Said he wanted to build a life as beautiful as art with me." I remembered that night, how radiant she'd looked when she called me with the news, how I'd swallowed my doubts and congratulated her. "There were signs," she continued, "small things at first. He'd criticize my friends. 'Melissa's a bit of a downer, isn't she?' Don't you think Jason drinks too much?" One by one, they all became problematic in some way. She twisted the edge of the hospital blanket between her fingers. "Then it was my schedule. Why don't you paint when I'm at work so we can spend evenings together? Reasonable, right? Except it became, why are you still in the studio? I've been waiting for dinner." I finished drying her hair and sat on the edge of the bed. "Why did you stay?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He told me if I left, he'd make sure I never had a career in art again, that his father would blacklist me with every gallery on the West Coast, that all those paintings I'd produced under his guidance would suddenly have credit issues, copyright disputes." Her hands trembled. And I believed him because I'd seen how they operated, how they crushed people who crossed them. Remember Eleanor Phillips, the critic who panned Richard's charity auction? Within a month, she'd lost her column, her book deal, everything. I took her cold hands in mine. "Natalie, look at me. No one can take your talent from you. No one can stop you from creating art. Even if you have to start over, build a new name, find new galleries, your gift is yours." She met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of her old fire. "I know that now," she said, lying there in that cold water, feeling the life drain out of me. "Everything became so clear. I've been drowning for years, Mom, long before they pushed me into that lake." I pulled her gently into my arms, careful of her injuries. "Then it's time to surface, to breathe again." She nodded against my shoulder. "I'm not going back to him, ever." "Good," I said firmly, "because I'd have to kill him if you did, and orange isn't my color." She laughed, a genuine laugh, if still weak, and the sound was like music to my ears. My daughter was coming back to herself, piece by piece. Later that evening, as Natalie slept, Linda Collins, the night nurse, came in to check her vitals. A kind woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and gentle hands, she'd been looking after Natalie since the first night. "She's doing much better," Linda said, noting the readings on the monitor. Her oxygen levels are almost normal now. Thanks to your care, I said sincerely. Linda smiled. Just doing my job. She hesitated, then added, Those lilies from the other day, they're still at the nurse's station. They're beautiful flowers. Are you sure you don't want them in here? Most patients love flowers. I felt a chill at the mention of Benjamin's gift. My daughter really is allergic to them, I lied smoothly. But please, feel free to enjoy them yourselves, or give them to another patient. Linda studied my face, and I had the distinct impression she saw through my excuse. You know, she said carefully, I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've seen a lot of injuries, a lot of accidents. She made air quotes around the word, and I understood what she was really saying. The doctor told me it was a boating accident, she continued. But those bruises on her arms, they look like handprints. And that cut on her temple? It's not from hitting water. It's from hitting something solid in the water. I said nothing, but I felt my expression harden. Linda checked the IV line, her movements efficient but gentle. My sister stayed with her husband for 15 years. 15 years of falling down the stairs and walking into doors. Until one day, he pushed her too hard, and she ended up in a hospital bed much like this one. She adjusted Natalie's blanket. Whatever happened out there on that lake, Mrs. Anderson, your daughter is lucky to have you. And if you need anything at all, you just let me know. The simple offer of alliance, of understanding, almost broke through my careful composure. Thank you, I managed. Linda nodded and moved toward the door. Oh, and those flowers? They ended up in the trash. Such a shame. Someone must have accidentally knocked them over. She winked and left the room. I sat back in my chair, feeling a small smile tug at my lips. Sometimes allies appeared in the most unexpected places. The climax came on the 7th day. Richard Moore was sitting in his huge office furnished with dark oak and leather. Perfect order on his desk. An expensive pen, a notebook, several phones. He skimmed the morning stock report on CNBC. He was calm. He had the situation under control. The family annoyance with his daughter-in-law barely bothered him. That was Benjamin's problem. Small, everyday, solvable. Women always cause trouble. You just have to show toughness, and they crawl back and apologize on their own. At that moment, one of his phones rang. The one without caller ID, the line for particularly sensitive conversations. He saw who was calling, and a satisfied smile appeared on his face. It was an old friend, an important man from the regional administration, Mayor Bill Hargrove, a man he had helped solve problems for many years, a man who owed him a favor. Bill Hargrove, pleased to hear from you, he said in his velvety, confident voice. To what do I owe the honor? But on the other end, he heard no friendly greeting, only a dry, cold, almost hostile tone. Richard, I need to speak to you seriously and not over the phone. Richard frowned. He didn't like this tone. It disrupted the accustomed order of things. Did something happen? Something happened. The voice on the phone grew harder. A man was here today. Claimed to be a journalist, though he looked more like a district attorney. Very persistent. Internally, something constricted in Richard for the first time. A cold, unpleasant lump. And what did he want? He asked, trying to keep his voice indifferent. He wanted to talk about that 22-year-old case. The case of a certain Henry Walker. He asked very unpleasant questions about the boat, about the money, about your argument with him the night before he died. He knew details that only 3 people could have known. You, me, and the deceased Detective Delaney. The office, which a minute ago seemed like a bastion of his power and stability, suddenly began to narrow. The air grew thin. He remained silent. Richard, Bill Hargrove continued, and there was no hint of old friendship in his voice, only steel. I covered this story up once. I will not do it a second time. My reputation is more important to me. I advise you to solve this problem quickly and make sure my name doesn't show up in it again, ever. Do you understand me?" And he hung up. Richard Moore sat in silence. The stock report on the monitor appeared to be a senseless jumble of numbers. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had pushed Natalie into the icy water, and for the first time in many years, he felt them begin to sweat. He didn't immediately understand. His brain, accustomed to direct threats, tax audits, hostile takeovers, couldn't reconcile the facts. Some journalist, an old case. What was the connection? He called Benjamin. Benjamin stumbled into the office, relaxed with a slight residual scent of alcohol. He spent the morning at the gym and then at a bar. He was still waiting for a call from Natalie. "What's wrong?" he asked sluggishly. Richard looked at his son, stared long and searchingly, and in his empty, self-satisfied eyes, he suddenly saw not his heir, but the source of all his problems. "Your mother-in-law," he said slowly, deliberately. "Did she say something? Threaten us?" Benjamin grinned. "The mother-in-law? What's she gonna do? She'll cry, complain to her Natalie. That's it." "Did she call anyone after it happened?" Benjamin thought it over. "I don't think so. She stood there on the shore like a statue. She was yelling something, but I didn't listen." And then it slowly dawned on Richard, like poison entering the bloodstream. That quiet, insignificant old woman whom they had never taken seriously. Her calm, dead voice on the phone when she took Benjamin's call. Her refusal to talk. That wasn't despair. That was a plan. He leaped up, going to the window. His world, so solid, so unshakable, built on money, contacts, and other people's fear, began to wobble. He understood that this wasn't about a family dispute, and not even about a drowned daughter-in-law. It was about what happened 22 years ago on the same lake. Someone had dug up the grave he had so carefully cemented over, and he knew who did it. Not her herself, of course. She just pressed the button. She pulled the cord. The call she made from the shore wasn't to the ambulance or the police. It was a call to the executioner. "She has a brother," he said dully, more to himself than to Benjamin. "Juan Anderson, journalist. Ex-journalist, rather. I'd completely forgotten about him." Benjamin looked at his father, confused. He didn't grasp the scale of the catastrophe. He was still thinking about his wife, the inconvenience, the ruined evening. But Richard had already understood everything. He had understood that the grenade he himself had placed in that quiet woman's hands had been unpinned. And all these years she had just been holding the safety lever. That day on the lake, she let go. He snatched the phone. He began calling everyone whose numbers were saved in the separate encrypted memory of the phone. People who had been fed by his hand for years, who owed him their position, their wealth. He called, and his voice, normally authoritative and calm, cracked, hoarse. He demanded, threatened, pleaded. He tried to start the usual mechanism, the mechanism of suppression, the mechanism of erasing inconvenient truths. But the mechanism failed. On the other end, he heard confusion, cold politeness, and more often, a short dial tone. His world no longer obeyed him. The people who had laughed ingratiatingly at his jokes yesterday now pretended not to recognize his voice. The ship had sprung a leak, and the rats were the first to feel it. They didn't just run. They tore up the ropes that tied them to him so he wouldn't drag them down to the depths. Benjamin stood pale and bewildered in the middle of the office. For the first time he saw his father, this monolith, this unshakable titan, so out of control, and fear, genuine sticky animal fear, began to seep into his soul too. He suddenly understood that the joke at the lake was more than just cruel play. It was the trigger for something terrifying, the full scope of which he couldn't yet grasp. Richard slammed down the phone after his 12th failed call. "Who is this Juan Anderson?" Benjamin asked, his voice unnaturally high. "What can he possibly do?" Richard's laugh was hollow. "It's not what he can do. It's what he already has done." He ran a hand through his silver hair, disheveling it for the first time Benjamin could remember. Juan Anderson was the journalist who exposed Senator Williams, destroyed his career, his reputation, everything. Williams had half the state in his pocket, and Anderson still brought him down. Benjamin sank into a chair. "But that was years ago. He's nobody now." "Nobody," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with contempt for his son's naivety. "Nobody who just got the mayor to cut ties with me. Nobody who apparently found Frank Delaney and got him talking. Nobody who's systematically dismantling 22 years of carefully constructed protection." "I don't understand," Benjamin said. "What does this have to do with Natalie?" "With the lake?" Richard stared at his son, seeing truly for the first time how limited he was, how small. "The lake, Benjamin. The same lake where Henry Walker drowned 22 years ago. My business partner. The man whose shares mysteriously came into my possession after his tragic accident." Understanding finally dawned on Benjamin's face. "You killed him," he whispered. Richard didn't confirm or deny it. He just turned away, his mind already calculating, planning. "Call Sam," he said finally. "Tell him I need a full team, tonight, and tell him to find Juan Anderson." Benjamin hesitated. "Sam Burke? Your security guy?" "Now!" Richard snapped. As Benjamin fumbled for his phone, Richard stared out at the city below. For 22 years, he'd built his empire, brick by careful brick. He'd cultivated the right friends, eliminated the right enemies, paid off the right officials. And now, because of one old woman on a lake shore, it was all in jeopardy. Across town, in a small, nondescript motel room, Juan Anderson's phone rang. "They're moving," said the voice without preamble. "Burke just called in his whole team. They're looking for you." Juan wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this. "Let them look," he said calmly. "Everything's already in motion." "Be careful, Anderson," the voice warned. "Burke isn't just a rent-a-cop. He's ex-Special Forces, the real deal, and he's bringing heavy hitters." "Then it's a good thing I'm not where they think I am," Juan replied. "Thanks for the heads up." He ended the call and looked at Ethan Walker, who sat across from him at the small table littered with documents, photos, and coffee cups. "Moore's sending his dogs," Juan said simply. Ethan's face paled. "Looking for you?" Juan nodded. "But they won't find me. Not until I want to be found." He gathered up the documents, sorting them into precise piles. "How do you feel about visiting your father's grave tomorrow?" Ethan looked confused. "His grave? Why?" Juan's smile was grim. "Because it's time for him to speak from beyond the grave, and for Richard Moore to finally face justice." The morning of the 8th day, Natalie was strong enough to take short walks down the hospital corridor. Her doctor, Emily Grant, was impressed with her recovery. "Most patients with her injuries and hypothermia would still be bedridden," she told me as we watched Natalie slowly make her way back to her room, leaning on a nurse's arm. "She has remarkable resilience." "She gets that from her father," I said quietly. "He never gave up on anything either." After settling Natalie back in bed with a book, I felt the walls of the hospital room closing in on me. I needed space to breathe, to think. The constant beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell were making my head throb. "I'm going to explore a bit," I told Natalie. "Get some fresh air." "Will you be all right?" She nodded, already absorbed in her novel. "I'm fine, Mom. Linda's bringing lunch soon anyway." I wandered the hospital corridors aimlessly at first, then found myself following signs to the hospital library. I remembered hearing one of the nurses mention it, a small collection mostly used by medical students and the occasional patient looking for distraction. The library was tucked away in the old wing of the hospital, down a corridor that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. A peeling sign on the door simply read "Library." I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, dusty, with a high vaulted ceiling. It smelled of old paper and neglect. Shelves full of books lined the walls. On a large table in the center, piles of books were stacked haphazardly, volumes that someone had borrowed at some point but never returned to their proper place. Chaos reigned, and I began to work, not because someone had asked me to, but because I needed to. It was the only thing I could do at that moment to preserve my own spiritual balance. I started sorting the books on the table. I picked up each one, wiped the dust from the cover, looked at the call number on the spine, and found its place on the shelf. Here, a tattered volume of Toni Morrison. I put her between Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. Classics with classics. Here, an old medical guide. It belonged on the top shelf in the technical literature section. Here, a thriller by James Patterson. It went to the foreign prose shelf. My movements were slow, methodical, almost ritualistic. I thought neither of the Moors nor Juan, not even of Natalie. I thought only of the books, of the fact that everything in this world should have its place, that an order once disturbed must be restored. I worked, and the chaos in the small hospital library gradually receded. The table became cleaner, the shelves filled up in strict alphabetical and thematic order. I was restoring harmony in this tiny enclosed space, and this simple physical activity gave me peace. It was creation, a counterweight to the destruction I had set in motion. Eventually, my phone rang. It was Juan. I wedged the phone between my ear and shoulder and continued shelving books. "He's running around like an animal in a cage," Juan said without preamble. His voice was calm, but I heard the notes of predatory joy in it. "He's calling everyone, trying to exert pressure, to buy people off, to intimidate, but it's too late. The information is leaked. His old friends are shunning him like a leper. He's become toxic." "Good," I said, placing a thick volume of Baldwin in its spot. "He knows it's me, and he knows you're behind me. He's going to try to act, probably with force. He'll send his people. I just wanted you to know." "I know," I replied. "Be careful. Don't worry about me," he laughed. "I haven't lived where I'm registered for a long time. I'm safe. But you'll need a good lawyer soon, although I'm afraid even that won't help." We said goodbye. I put the phone in my pocket and picked up the next book. It was a children's book of fairy tales with bright pictures. I ran my hand over the glossy cover. I wasn't afraid for Juan. He was in his element. I felt no hatred toward the Moors. To me, they were no longer people, but objects, pieces on a chessboard that I myself had maneuvered into a state of zugzwang. I didn't need to see their panic. I didn't need to hear their anxious voices. Their agony didn't interest me. In that moment, in this quiet, dusty library, I was absolutely calm. I was simply restoring order in the library, in my life, and in my daughter's world. I knew that soon the last book would find its place on the shelf, and then silence would fall. Real, full, final silence. When the last book from the table found its place on the shelf, I felt a deep weariness, not physical but spiritual, as if I had finished a very long and difficult task. I looked around the quiet, tidied room. Harmony now reigned here. As I was preparing to leave, the door opened and Linda Collins, the night nurse who had become our ally, walked in. She looked surprised to see me. "Mrs. Anderson, what are you doing here?" "Just organizing," I said, gesturing to the now orderly shelves. "Old habits. Once a librarian, always a librarian." She looked around the room, clearly impressed. "It looks amazing. I've been here 5 years and never seen this place so tidy." She paused, studying my face. "Are you okay? You look different." "I'm at peace," I said simply. Linda nodded slowly, as if understanding something profound. "I came to find you because your daughter is asking for you, and there's a police officer waiting to speak with you both." I wasn't surprised. I had expected this. "About the lake?" "Yes. Apparently a fisherman named Jack Cooper made a formal report about the incident. Said he couldn't sleep knowing what those men did." I smiled faintly. The wheels of justice were turning now. Unstoppable. "I'll be right there." As we walked back through the hospital corridors, Linda touched my arm gently. "Whatever happens, Mrs. Anderson, you're not alone in this. Some of us understand what it's like to face men like that." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard Moore's agony reached its peak. He had exhausted all his resources. His calls were no longer connected. His threats only elicited irritation. He understood that his empire, which had seemed eternal and unshakable to him, was only a house of cards, and someone had pulled the most important card from the foundation. Desperation is a poor advisor. It makes smart people do stupid, predictable things, and Richard, having lost the ability to act subtly, decided to proceed coarsely. He resorted to the last argument he had left: violence. He called the head of his security detail Sam Burke, a sullen man with a heavy jaw and vacant eyes, a former Special Forces soldier who carried out the dirtiest jobs for him. "I need the address of this journalist Anderson, and I need him to be spoken to very seriously. So seriously that he forgets not only my name, but his own." Burke nodded silently. For him, it was routine work. Finding an address in this city was not difficult, especially with access to certain databases. An hour later, 2 inconspicuous dark cars with no license plates pulled into the courtyard of an old housing project on the outskirts of the city. 4 sturdy men in identical black jackets got out. They entered the stairwell, which smelled of cats and dampness, unhurriedly but purposefully, and climbed to the 7th floor. They went to apartment number 47, a shabby faux leather door, an old, almost antique doorbell. One of them pressed the button. In response, silence. He pressed it again. Still silence. "Enter," the oldest one briefly commanded. They didn't bother with the lock. One of them, the largest, stepped back a few paces, took a running start, and tore the door frame and all off its hinges with a deafening crash. They stormed inside, but the apartment was empty. It wasn't just empty. It was dead. A thin layer of dust on the old, mismatched furniture, a stack of yellowed newspapers on the kitchen table, a dried-up plant in a pot on the windowsill. It was obvious that no one had lived here for a long time. They had walked into a trap, a simple one, but humiliating precisely because of its simplicity. While they stared at each other in the gloom of the deserted apartment, my brother Juan, only a few miles away in a faceless rented hotel room, looked at his laptop screen. A simple blog platform was open on the screen. The text was already entered. The headline glowed in bold, aggressive letters. "Drowned twice in the same lake. The 22-year history of impunity." Below the headline was a dry but devastating text. Facts, data, names, copies of Walker's letters, quotes from a secret interview with the former Detective Delaney recorded on a voice recorder, the testimony of the fisherman who rescued Natalie, the photo of the bouquet of lilies with the accompanying note, and finally the report of what had happened at the lake 8 days ago. Everything was laid out with cold procedural precision, without emotion, without accusation, just facts. But their totality was more terrifying than any verdict. Juan looked at the clock. He had been waiting for this moment. He knew they would come for him. He himself had given them this hint through one of his informants. He knew that brute force would be their last desperate move, and he used it. Exactly at the moment Burke's men broke down the door to his old apartment, thereby demonstrating their methods to the entire neighborhood, Juan moved the cursor to the Publish button. Below the article, an address list was already prepared. Email addresses of all the major news agencies in the country, the editorial offices of all the regional and national TV channels, the official addresses of the district attorney's office, the Department of Justice, the addresses of well-known bloggers and public figures. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and pressed the button. In the next second, he hit send in his email program. That was it. The mechanism was set in motion. The genie was out of the bottle. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. But then his cell phone, which lay next to him on the table, began to vibrate. First one call, then a second. Then it vibrated nonstop. Journalists smelling blood pounced on the prey. The story that Richard Moore had so carefully tried to bury didn't just come to light. It exploded. The attempt at physical pressure, the broken-down apartment door, all of it became not a refutation, but a confirmation. It turned an investigative report into a crime story. The story instantly went viral. Dozens of websites picked it up. It spread across social media. Within a few hours, the name Moore went from being a symbol of success and respectability to a synonym for crime and cruelty. Their final desperate attempt to silence the truth only caused the truth to scream loudly. So loud that everyone could hear it. They wanted to put out a spark, but instead they caused a wildfire. And now all that remained for them was to stand and watch the flames consume their world. Juan turned off the phone and the laptop. He stowed them in his bag, stood up, and went to the window. Outside, a strange, indifferent city bustled. His work was done. Now other forces would take action, larger and slower. The state apparatus, public opinion. He had done what he did best. He had simply told the story, the true story. And the truth, as we know, is sometimes more terrifying than any fiction. Across town, in Richard Moore's office, the phone on his desk rang. It was Benjamin. "Dad, have you seen the news?" His voice was high-pitched, panicky. Richard hadn't. He'd been in meetings all morning, desperately trying to shore up support among his remaining allies. "What news?" "It's everywhere. The Walker case. Your name. Everything. They're saying you killed him, and they're connecting it to what happened to Natalie. There are police outside the building. They're asking for you." Richard's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Where's Burke?" "That's the other thing." Benjamin's voice cracked. "Someone took a video of his men breaking down an apartment door. It's all over social media. They're calling it attempted intimidation of a witness. Dad, what do we do?" Richard stood slowly, moving to the window of his corner office. From this height, he could see the flashing lights of police cars at the entrance to his building. His empire, built over decades, dismantled in a matter of days. All because of a woman on a lake shore who refused to scream and beg, who had simply made a phone call. "Dad, are you there?" Benjamin was still on the line, his voice growing more desperate. "I'm here," Richard said quietly, watching as uniformed officers entered the building below. "But I don't think I will be for long." 1 month later, the headlines were different, but no less sensational. Moore Financial CEO indicted on multiple charges, including first-degree murder. Son of murdered businessman speaks out. Justice delayed, but not denied. Benjamin Moore released on bail divorce proceedings initiated. I sat in the small cafe across from the courthouse, scanning the newspaper while waiting for Natalie to join me. The preliminary hearing had gone well. Richard Moore was denied bail, considered both a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. Benjamin had been charged as an accessory in the attack on Natalie, but was released pending trial. Jack Cooper, the fisherman who had saved my daughter's life, had become something of a local hero. His testimony about that day at the lake was damning. Linda Collins, the night nurse, had also come forward, documenting the extent of Natalie's injuries in meticulous detail. Juan had retreated back into the shadows, his work done. But he'd left a legacy. The Juan Anderson Whistleblower Fund had been established anonymously, providing legal and financial support to those exposing corporate corruption. I smiled, knowing exactly who was behind it. The bell above the cafe door jingled and Natalie walked in. The bruises on her face had faded, and she moved with more confidence than I'd seen in years. She slid into the seat across from me, a folder tucked under her arm. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting the folder on the table. The meeting with the gallery ran long. I folded the newspaper and pushed it aside. "Good news, I hope." She grinned, and I saw a flash of the vibrant young artist who had been buried beneath Benjamin's control for so long. "They want to showcase my new series. Opening night is in 3 months." "That's wonderful, honey." I reached across and squeezed her hand. "I told you your talent was always yours." "I know." She opened the folder and slid a document across to me. "That's why I want you to have this." I looked down at the paper. It was a deed to a small apartment near the public library downtown. My old apartment, the one I had sold to help Natalie and Benjamin with their down payment 5 years ago. "How?" I began. "Part of the divorce settlement," she said. "I made it clear to Benjamin that he could fight me and face criminal charges for what happened at the lake. Or he could sign over the apartment he bought with my money. Technically your money, and I wouldn't push for the maximum penalty." "And he agreed?" She nodded. "His lawyers made him. They're desperate to salvage whatever they can of the Moore reputation." She leaned forward, her eyes bright. "It's not in the best shape. Needs some renovation. But it's ours again, Mom. Our home." I ran my fingers over the deed, emotions welling up. "Natalie, you don't have to do this. You could sell it. Use the money for a fresh start somewhere else." "I don't want a fresh start somewhere else," she said firmly. "I want to go back to the beginning, back to where I was truly happy. With you, in that little apartment with the big windows where I used to paint." She took a deep breath. "Besides, I've already started painting again. Real painting, my style. And guess what the new series is called?" "What?" "Surfacing." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a canvas. It was striking. Dark water giving way to light. A female figure breaking through the surface, arms outstretched toward the sky. Bold colors, powerful strokes. Unmistakably Natalie's original style, but with a new depth, a hard-won wisdom in every brushstroke. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice catching. "It's healing," she corrected gently. "For both of us." We walked back to her temporary apartment together, making plans for renovating our old home. As we turned the corner, a familiar figure was waiting on the steps. Ethan Walker, Henry's son, stood awkwardly with a small potted plant in his hands. He and Natalie had met during the investigation, both victims of the Moore family's cruelty in different ways. I thought you might like this for your new place," he said, offering her the plant. "It's an eastern redbud. They're resilient, can survive almost anything." Natalie took the plant, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you. Would you like to come up for coffee? My mom and I were just talking about paint colors for the new apartment." Ethan smiled, a shy, tentative thing. "I'd like that." As they talked, I hung back slightly, watching my daughter come alive in conversation, seeing her gesture animatedly as she described her vision for her studio space. Ethan listened intently, offering thoughtful suggestions, his eyes never leaving her face. Life was returning, not just to Natalie, but to all of us. Justice had been served, not through screaming or pleading, but through quiet, determined action. Through restoring order to a world knocked off its axis by the arrogance of men who thought themselves above consequences. That evening, after Ethan had left with a promise to help with the renovation, Natalie and I sat on her small balcony watching the sunset over the city. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Making that call to Juan?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret not seeing the Moors for what they were sooner. But I don't regret protecting you or seeking justice for Henry Walker after all these years." She nodded, sipping her tea. "I've been thinking a lot about that day at the lake, about how close I came to—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. But in a strange way, it set me free. Falling into that water, feeling the cold seep into my bones. It woke me up. Made me see how I'd been drowning for years in that marriage. "Sometimes we need to hit rock bottom before we can push off and rise to the surface," I said. "Exactly." She smiled at me, her father's smile full of warmth and determination. "But you know what made the difference? Knowing someone was there on the shore, fighting for me, not giving up." I reached over and took her hand. "I'll always be there, Natalie. Always." A month passed. I stood in the middle of the living room, which was until recently unfamiliar and now simply empty. The air smelled of cardboard, dust, and departure. Sunbeams falling through the dirty windows drew long streaks on the floor where dust particles danced. The last box was taped shut. I ran my hand over it. On it, in Natalie's handwriting, was written, "Books. Handle with care." My daughter sat on the windowsill, hugging her knees. She looked out at the street, at the busy, indifferent city life. In this month, she had changed a lot. Not externally. Externally, she was still the same slender, fair, with large, serious eyes. But something had disappeared from her gaze. The desperate, ingratiating effort to please everyone was gone. The fear was gone. In its place was a quiet, slightly melancholic wisdom. She had grown up more in this month than in the last 10 years. We worked in silence, a cozy, comforting silence that exists only between very close people. We didn't need words to understand each other. Every movement was full of meaning. Here, I carefully wrapped her favorite mug in newspaper, and she nodded gratefully. Here, she found an old photo of the two of us in the park, and a light, gentle smile appeared on her lips. We weren't just packing things. We were clearing the debris of her former life, carefully separating what was worth keeping from what had to stay here forever. In this month, the world around us had turned upside down. The story published by Juan had the effect of a bomb. A criminal case was initiated. First one for the attempted murder of Natalie. Then, after the testimonies of the old detective and Walker's son, the old case from 22 years ago was also reopened. Richard and Benjamin were arrested. Their faces, confused, disbelieving, were shown on all the television channels. Their business empire collapsed. Partners turned away. Accounts were frozen. Their world, built on fear and money, crumbled to dust. We didn't follow it closely. We didn't read the news, didn't watch the talk shows discussing their case. We didn't need to. Our war ended the day Juan pressed the publish button. Everything else was just the consequence. We were only interested in our own small, quiet life. Natalie filed for divorce. It was her decision, made firmly, calmly, without tears or hysteria. Benjamin tried to write her long letters from jail full of remorse and love. He suddenly remembered how much he loved her, how much he needed her. Natalie read these letters and then silently tore them into small pieces. She no longer believed in words. The icy water of the lake had taught her to believe only in actions, and now the last box was taped shut. The chapter of that life was closed. Natalie jumped off the windowsill and came over to me. She looked around the empty walls, the bare floor. Nothing connected her to this place anymore. "Where are we going now?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, a little uncertain, like that of a person who has wandered in the dark for a long time and suddenly stepped into the light. I silently pulled the keys from my pocket. Old, familiar keys with a small silver book charm she'd given me many years ago. "I bought back our old apartment," I said simply. "The 2-bedroom near the public library, remember?" She looked at me and her eyes widened. Surprise flashed across them, then a warm, silent joy. The apartment, small 2 rooms in the old brick building, the creaking hardwood floors, the high ceiling, the huge window in her room that looked out onto a quiet green courtyard. That was the place where she grew up, the place where we had been happy. I had sold it when Natalie got married to help them with the down payment on this big empty house. I had regretted it all these years. And now I had our home back. I put the keys in her palm. "We'll have to renovate, but the walls are standing, and so are our stories. I think we have an unfinished story there. It's time to write the ending." She squeezed the keys in her hand, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a genuine, sincere smile on her face. Not a forced one, not a strained one, but her own. "Yes, Mom," she said. "It's time." We left the apartment without looking back. I closed the door behind us and left the key in the lock. We didn't need it anymore. We walked down the stairs. Outside, a moving truck and Ethan's pickup were waiting. He got out when he saw us, coming to take the boxes from our hands. "Everything ready?" he asked, his eyes on Natalie. "Everything's perfect," she replied, and I saw the way they looked at each other. Cautious, healing, but with a spark of something that might, someday, become more. We drove through the city, illuminated by the evening sun. I looked at the road, and for the first time in many years, I felt no fear of the future. I knew we would make it. My freedom wasn't that my enemies were punished, nor that I was finally believed. My true freedom was sitting next to me now. She was looking out the window at the passing houses, and the evening sky was reflected in her eyes. Freedom is the safety of my child and the quiet, simple possibility of starting over in the small apartment near the library where unfinished stories and unread books are waiting for their moment. And we had time ahead of us. A whole life to reach them all. This concludes the story of Helen Anderson, a story about quiet strength, a mother's love, and justice that sometimes comes not through loud court proceedings, but through a single phone call. This narrative prompts reflection. Where is the line between revenge and restoring order? Between forgiveness and impunity? Helen didn't scream or plead with the consciences of those who had none. She chose a different path, a cold, calculated one, and as it turned out, the only correct one. What do you think? Did she act correctly? Could she have acted differently, trusting a system that had already failed once? Or is her action the only possible response to absolute evil hiding behind a mask of respectability? This choice is not just a plot twist. It is a profound moral question to which everyone will likely have their own answer. I would be very interested to know exactly what you think about it. What would you do if you were in Helen's place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. If this story has touched you, please support our channel. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and of course, share your opinion. Your feedback and participation are the best reward for us and what allows us to continue creating new, equally captivating stories for you. Thank you for reading. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.